The title of my today's presentation, AI Ethics Code from an Ethical Framework to an Ethical Process. And it already got introduced very nicely. It is about bringing relevant actors in the process of AI together. As it was introduced, I'm working for the Fraunhofer Center for International Management and Knowledge Economy. I'm also working for the Competence Center E-Standards. Here you see the German name of it because we are supporting companies in Germany, and we are an institute or competence center consisting of 5 partner institutes, and we are in a big network of 26 competence centers all over Germany, and we are funded by the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. So if you know somebody or a company who needs some help in digitalization projects, please feel free to contact us or me directly, and I'm working there as the AI ethics expert. So during the conference, and I'm very delighted that all of you are here, although it's already quite late and we all had a long day. We talked a lot about principles, we talked a lot about what we already achieved, and we definitely achieved a lot has been done. We have, and I guess most of you already know this overview because lots of people of the conference worked on that, summarizing different principles that should be guiding AI. So it's about beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and explicability. But during the conference, we also already recognized that a lot still has to be done because, of course, we all agree that justice and all these things are really important, but putting these into practice is so difficult, and we have still a lot of ethical problems in the field of AI. So to give one example of these problems, I want to talk about the researcher Joseph Redman, who is the creator of the very popular YOLO algorithm. This algorithm, probably you also heard about that. It uses convolutional neural networks to provide real-time object detection. So it's a field of computer vision which enables computers to gain high-level understanding of digital pictures or videos. And as you can imagine, this is used in different fields for detecting traffic signals, of course, also detecting people, and in the field of autonomous driving. And as you might also guess, it's also used in the field of the military and also to harness human weaknesses based on their behavior on social platforms. And here I want to quote Joseph Redman because at the end of his paper about this YOLO algorithm, where he was writing about improvements of it, he also wrote the following when he was talking about computer vision research in general. So he writes, a lot of the people doing this research are at Google and Facebook, and I guess at least we know that the technology is in good hands and definitely won't be used to harvest our personal information and sell it to wait, you're saying that's exactly what it will be used for? Oh, okay. Well, the other people heavily funding vision research are the military, and they've never done anything horrible like killing lots of people with new technology. Oh, wait. And then he says computer vision is already being put to questionable use, and as researchers, we have the responsibility to at least consider the harm of our work and think of ways to mitigate it. We owe the world that much. And for me, it's really important to quote him here because it's not that common that in a very technical paper, researchers are also writing about this responsibility. And that's what AI ethics is about, to also write or to also reflect on that, even if it's not the main job, so to say. However, 2 years later, Joseph Redman, he stopped doing computer vision research because of ethical concerns, because he recognized that his very, very efficient and really great algorithm is misused in the world, so to say. And this was in 2020, so it is not that long ago. So with this, and we already talked a lot about such examples during the conference. I want to stress that we have reached a lot in the field of AI ethics, but we are just at a starting point. We need these principles, we need to have a common understanding of what we want, but this is just the starting point and good focal points, but we cannot have AI ethics to be formulaic only. So we cannot solve ethical conflicts like mathematical equations, because in comparison to mathematics, ethics is a process and not a destination. That's also why the title is about an ethical process. So we talked a lot about principalism. We also talked a lot about ethics by design. And as I said, these are important parts, but only parts of it. So another part, and this was also touched upon a lot during the conference, is data ethics. So of course, everything we use for the algorithms is also part of AI ethics. And last but not least, the moral judgment of the people who are designing, programming, using, or maintaining AI. So let's now look at the AI life cycle, because it is really important if we think about a process or the thing that AI ethics should not be formulaic. We really have to think about what it then should be. And for this, it is also, of course, important to know how AI works. So mostly the process begins with raw data. So we have all our data that is coming from the real world. So everything we post on the internet or so can be part of an AI system, or also of, if we use a translation software on the internet, this can all be used for an AI system. So this is then refined and often used as training data in order to train the AI system to detect specific patterns, what it then needs for decision making or the action that is required by the system. And then at the end, we have the AI system in place when it's in action. So we have real-time data coming, we have the algorithm working, which is trained at that point already, and then we have output data, which can be in action or decision making. And through the whole process, we of course have design phase, and at the process a validation phase as well. But what we are still missing here is, of course, the algorithm itself. So we need to have the development of an analytic method and the implementation, and then the people who are using it need to select the method or the algorithm itself, which is then part of the whole AI process. So the idea of this process is that it should be a routine when people are working on AI. And how can we make it ethical? Because this is now just a process, how an AI can function. We need to see where can problems be detected and who is responsible there. And this is the combination of two models from different researchers, and it's still work in progress, so to say. And here we see now specific numbers, and these are the responsibilities that we can detect here. So one is the society as a whole. So all the data that is generated. 2 is researchers, developers, and engineers. And no, 2 is data scientists, of course, I'm sorry. And 3 is researchers, developers, and engineers. So this would be Joseph Redmond working on the YOLO algorithm, developing it and then giving it to the world to use it in different contexts. And 4 would be the person or the institute working with the algorithm or requesting an algorithm in general. And here we have different actions in place. So as I said, of course, the society as a whole is part of it. Of course, we have to think about it because it's not really controllable what the society as a whole is doing. But it's really important when we talk about AI ethics that very often AI systems are reflecting the problems of the real analog world. So somehow there is a really comprehensive responsibility because this data is also reflecting our stereotypes from our analog world. As I said, the researchers, developers, engineers who are developing the architecture, they develop this algorithm and they also implement it. Then we have the whole tasks of the data scientists who collect, select, hopefully curate the data, they train the data, and they also have a look on the interpretation of the data. And last but not least, we have the people or the institutions using AI. Of course, they also influence the provision of the data. And also at the end, they want to use the interpreted data in form of a decision-making process of the system or a specific action. Okay, so we see we have different responsibilities here. And as we might guess, all of them are talking or having different understandings, different languages. So how can we bring them together? How can we make them talk to each other? And for this, I want to shortly at the end introduce the practical syllogism, which is an ethical heuristic, which is easy to use in everyday life. And it consists of 3 levels. The first level are our normative ideals, so what is important for us. The second part is the empirical conditions, like where are we embedded? We are embedded in a physical and also in a digital world. And very often this embeddedness makes it rather difficult to realize these normative ideals, which I actually think are really important for me. And those 2 then lead me to a specific judgment or a specific decision making. And just exemplary, I want to talk about the different actors that I showed you in this AI process, that it's really, already difficult to see or to compare them because very often they have different understandings of the world as it is. So the society as a whole, of course, most of the people say, and that's why I was also presenting the principles at the beginning, that fairness is important, justice is important, beneficence, autonomy is important. But of course, we are embedded in our reality and we also want to enjoy the convenience of technology. We want to consume and share much data on internet platforms. And I could now mention so many different more things why we really like these great technologies. But of course, this makes it sometimes hard to adhere to these ideals. And if a person is not trained, if digital literacy, as we talked about that very often during the conference, is not very high, people can, in their everyday life, just think, okay, my data does not really has an influence, so I just share whatever I want on the internet, for instance. So there are also the developers, people like Joseph Fredman, who, for instance, work on an algorithm like the YOLO algorithm. And of course, or maybe not of course, but as an example, they want to adhere to the ideal explicability. However, explicability in some cases comes at the expense of accuracy or also efficiency. So if they have the possibility that it can still be accurate, but it needs more time, and of course, very often researchers are also embedded in businesses they are working for, institutes they are working for, and there again the economic incentives play a really big role. So we have cost reductions, fast implementation, and efficiency. And here we see, okay, sometimes economic incentives can be stronger than ethical values or these normative ideals that we have here. And the same goes for data scientists who want to have rich data, qualitative data, all the stuff that we already talked about at the conference. But again, due to the reality and their embeddedness, it can be difficult to be realized. So to just at the end also talk about other interesting relevant actors in this process, we also have official institutions using AI, companies using AI, and private people using AI. So just to go shortly back to this overview, over here, where we have the people using the AI system, but also feeding it with the data. And again, at that point, I don't want to go into detail of all the different other actors here, but I think it already became clear that this ethical heuristic is a good starting point to see, okay, what is a data scientist thinking? Like, if I'm a company that wants to just have an automation process here and doesn't want to think about ethical issues or so, it's really important to explain that you need to understand how the relevant actors in this process are thinking, what are the aims, how are they embedded, and what issues can we still tackle. So this is something that should be part of these processes and could be used to also train digital literacy, because it very much helps to understand also the issues of engineers, data scientists, and so on, because it's so easy to say, let's have just let's have autonomy and justice in AI, but we need to see how are these actors all embedded so that we can develop a common language together. So as we already said at the conference quite often, we need interdisciplinarity on all levels, and also a way of making these different actors talking to each other. And part of that would be to really put ethics into the curricula, also of tech, or especially of technical sciences, because as it was shown in this practical syllogism, these are rather number-driven people, as they have to be. They have to program stuff, they have to work with data, they are embedded in the business environment. So they somehow need this training of ethics already in the curricula in the universities, but also the business structures need to promote this interdisciplinary work. And yeah, on this right side, you see the nice overview of the conference. And that's what I like so much at this conference, that we bring people together from different disciplines. And also this is a really good starting point where we can and should go on working with it. And the last point, and I think that became already quite clear in different talks, the regulations and risk assessments need to be rather strong, I would say, because economic incentives can be too strong. Last but not least, I just want to shortly invite you to our upcoming workshop in February. It is in German, so that's what I have to say already, and it's for small and medium-sized companies to train them, as I showed already, about ethical AI processes. And with this, I want to stop, say thank you very much. And yeah, I would be happy if we can keep in touch and promote ethics together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. And it's also very, very nice to hear somebody who looks into the future and has suggestions for how we should proceed from where we are momentarily. I was thinking, since we're only 2 people today, I would still like to ask, is this your last, is this your, oh, that's, I'm seeing somebody on a street.
Actually, I try to stop.
You try to stop. Okay, you succeeded. Thank you so much. Now, do we have any questions to this presentation before we move on to the next? Okay, no questions. Well, in that case, I suggest we move on. And we're going to listen to Jakob Dahl Ranthoff you're a professor of philosophy and management at the Department of Business and Social Sciences at Roskilde University. You've also been a visiting professor in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different cities. So I'm not going to mention all of them. You have been all over the world, and you're going to give us a paper where you will focus on the ethical concerns implied in the use of AI in the workplace. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will start by trying to share my screen. Yes.
I think it's going to work. Yes.
Okay. Yes, my name is Jakob Ranthoff from Roskilde University in Denmark. And my field is ethics, business ethics, and philosophy of management. And I have a colleague who is starting to work on robot ethics and who does work in this field. So I would like to accomplish this work by also working on the ethics of artificial intelligence. So here you have my starting point, trying to localize these issues. I think our research group should try to focus on these issues in relation to organization and management. Our research group is called Organization and Management. So you see here the title of my paper is called The Ethics of AI in the Workplace, Outline of Ethical Principles.
If I can just say something, because I think we're seeing slide 14, towards an ethical regulation and deontology.
Oh, very strange. Why are you doing this?
Now we see the first slide, challenge and the rise of the robot.
Okay, so you see the first slide. I tried this one.
Yeah.
Do you see one called The Ethics of AI? Yes, you started with the end of my presentation. Very strange. Okay, but this was the title, The Ethics of AI in the Workplace, Outline of Ethical Principles. And then, for example, I can mention this advertisement for a book called The Challenge of the Rise of the Robots. And they talk about intelligent algorithms, travel agents, data analysts, and they talk about doctors, taxi drivers, and computer programmers are replaced by robots. And they talk about how this would change our society. So this is the whole discussion of the role of robots in the workplace. There's also this problem that many jobs will in the future not exist anymore. They would be replaced by robots. maybe even a university professor would be replaced by a learning or teaching robot. So of course we have to discuss this challenge of the robots. So my discussion is, what should the ethics be of this AI in the workplace? So I am searching for some ethical principles. I will focus on ethical concerns of AI in the workplace, and I'm especially interested in robots. And here you have a slide, another slide I found talking about removing human responsibility, reducing human control, enabling human wrongdoing, evaluating human skills, eroding human self-determination. So we are really facing a challenge with the robots, an ethical challenge of rethinking the workplace, you can say.
Can I just interrupt you? I'm sorry, Jacob, but you're in my view, you're still on slide 1.
Very strange. Can you see it now?
We see it's not in presentation mode, and we see it in the normal mode, and we still see just the first slide. And we can see the next one is a slide of which shows the rise of robots. Yes, that's the second
strange.
one.
You are screen sharing. Okay, your screen sharing is paused. It says stop share. Okay. I try again. Okay. Share screen. So very.
I can make you host. Why don't I try and make you host? Then you're the host of this.
Yeah, I don't know whether this will solve.
Hey there, Christina Damon here. I believe that you are fine in the host status. Your screen sharing was fine. You need to, it probably is easier if you go in presenter mode. It should be sort of the 4th icon on the top, and then you can go through with your arrow mode.
The presenter
mode is too difficult. You can also just manually click on each one, and that should work.
I was just doing slideshow, but it seems like it doesn't work.
Stuck. You could probably just go in the same mode that you were in before and then just manually click on it, and then we can see that as well, but you're just going to have to manually go over with it on the cursor and click on it.
Okay, but could I do screen sharing now?
Sure.
Okay, if I can just interrupt, I can see we've got the 3rd speaker here.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a bit of issues with the access.
Okay.
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 Should I try again?
So we've got the ethics of AI in the workplace, the first slide.
Yeah, and then I try to, can you still see it? And then I try to
see the first slide.
Can you see the number 2 slide now?
No.
I think you just, it's probably easiest if you just go over it with your icon.
Ah, now I see. I try this one. No. Yeah, but I tried to make presentation, and then and like this. You can see now.
We can still see the first slide.
No, you can only see the.
It's probably easiest if you just go with your mouse cursor and just click on 2, because we can see it. I mean, it's not a presenter modus, but that's not.
This one they can see now.
We can see ethics of AI in the workplace.
It's the same. It will not change. I mean, the PowerPoint why doesn't it?
Do you want to just go with your cursor and click on number 2 and then just go through manually? That works too.
Does it work like this?
Yeah.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is number 2. Yeah, okay. I reached this one and I was talking about all the challenges. Then I was going to but I don't understand why you, okay, yeah. Okay, so there's a respect for autonomy and informed consent, which is of course an important issue. So here you see this one, this slide, as you see, and a primary concern in this context could be the definition of stakeholder autonomy and informed consent of implied stakeholders in the use of different AI technologies. For example, robots, surveillance technologies, IT solution, and so on. And here the challenge is how business and companies can use robots to improve the workplace. So you see, how can we talk about the company's values? What is the role of the workers in relation to the use of robots in the workplace? We have, for example, a case of introduction of robots in healthcare in a hospital. And what happened was that the robots starting to do a lot of work while what happened to the employees where they were serving the robots. The robot did things quicker, and then there was this kind of a role of the employees in the hospital to facilitate that the robots did their work. So that when we talk about this interaction between human beings and robots in the workplace, there's also some new things emergent, which can be very interesting. So we can ask this question of the ethical principle of AI in the workplace. And here there can be a tension between individual conception of autonomy and well-being in relation to the concern for utility and well-being. An important factor is here the tension between autonomy and vulnerability in this use of ethics in the workplace. You have the autonomy of the human beings as agents, and then there you also have their vulnerability. And this relates to the way the robots enter in the workplace, because I found this on the internet. You can see you have where robots function as agents in the short term as they help human beings. But there's also the other question: what happens when the artificial intelligence robots also become subjects? There's also an interesting discussion of this actor network theory that we can apply in this situation. I think that the perspective shifts radically when we move from seeing robots as agents to see them as subjects. So of course, then we have the question of justice, harm and injustice for people in society. How can the use of artificial intelligence in the workplace have impact of broader conceptions of social justice in society? And here we have, I think, several times talked about the bias in relation to the use of artificial intelligence. For example, in Denmark, they used a system for looking at people who were unemployed. And this system immediately categorized people in different groups, and according to the information given, but there's always the problem of bias. So the problem of the use of AI in the workplace is related also to the problem of concern of data. and the protection of individually affected stakeholders. So we have this relation between social justice and use of robots. So, so this relates to the discussion of what are the ethical implications for the stakeholders, and it relates to our concept of humanity, the interaction between human beings and the control over the machine in the workplace. And this relates to the problem of our social expectations to the robots. I mentioned the colleague who analyzed the role of robots in the hospital setting. And here you see that the relation to robots, the human-machine relation, is in a sense a social relation also. But here we can also talk about implied legal issues of safety of use of the robots in the workplace, and how do we manage the expectations of people in relation to robots? What expectations do we have to the robots? And what are the social expectations in contrast to the robots? And when we have the robots in the workplace, of course, the discussion is, what is the impact of the concept of the self, on the concept of a self, and indeed the concept of our humanity in relation to the ethics of use of AI robots in the workplace. So you see here a slide relating to this issue, and it asks the more fundamental question that we talk about in science fiction, but which in some sense with all this discussion of robots becomes more and more a fundamental question of how, can we say that robots destroy our humanity, and how do they change our humanity? With a large global increase of the use of robots in relation to many functions at work, there is a problem of what is the impact of our humanity on the robots and on the very concept of humanity. I remember in some years ago in Saudi Arabia, they introduced a female robot. And in a sense, this robot had more rights than the female citizens of the country. So there's also some interesting challenges to discuss in that context. How does the robot influence our concept of humanity? And this restates this fundamental philosophical question of our post-humanism or transhumanism in relation to our use of technology. We can ask the question, how should we conceptualize a new human being that lives in close interaction with robots and machines? What happens to our human life when we become technological creations? There's also the idea, for example, wearable robots. If I get a lose a leg, I may be replaced by a machine, and there's the human, the interface between technology and the human being, and how do I guide myself if I become half a machine? And what happens to our creation of meaning, our sense of meaning, when we are confronted with the power of the robots? Or will robot workers be stronger, more creative, and find new forms of interactions between humanity of the world and the world? So there's this interesting discussion of humanism and transhumanism in relation to robots. And this leads to this question, should we apply our ethical principles to robots? But here we have the principle of autonomy, dignity, integrity, and vulnerability that we apply to human beings. But should we also apply such concept to robots, or can we do what we want with robots? Is a human ethics transferred to robots? For example, we say the concept of dignity or integrity or at least vulnerability, applies to humans. But can we apply our traditional ethical concepts to robots? So that's also a big discussion. So I'm interested also in this social theory of robots in the workplace. So that's the general reflection of how social theory should conceive this emergence of the robots in the workplace. As I said, how they change our humanity and also the interactions between human beings and social robots in the workplace. And it leads to the bigger question of whether we can talk about cyber robotics. We talked about the human being as cyborgs, but can the cyborgs and humans, cyber robotics, unite in a mutual or common existence? So I think this, for example, referring to this book, how if we go to the organization, how the human-machine interface becomes essential in organizations, and how companies innovate and develop through this human-machine interface. And here towards the end, I just have 2 slides. If we should have ethical guidelines, I think my argument here shows that it raises a lot of philosophical questions that are not yet answered. But I was thinking about what should ethical guidelines be. And here I found this very optimistic ethical deontology, the robot factory, our code of ethics for engineers, which is actually the idea of advancement and well-being for the civilized world. That is probably the dream of a deontology of robot ethics that opens for the well-being of the future. You can call it a very optimistic thing about robot ethics. For example, pay attention to your dreams. And number 10, remember the best robots are the ones you haven't thought of yet. That's really optimism, but it's also really transhumanism. And then for my last slide, I would be more modest and say we need some more modest guidelines. I would say we need more public consultancy about robot ethics. We need more democratic input to discuss these workplace robots. It's about how to put human beings in the center of innovation. And here still, it's very important with the protection of privacy, integrity, and dignity. It is important to be aware of the limits of robot decision-making. It is important with responsible use of data and application of data. It is important to increase knowledge about AI and algorithm in the general population. And I will still have some defense of the idea of that we should have human control over the machines. So this was my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Now we are very, very lucky. I hope you don't mind that we're just going to take the questions right at the end, because we're very lucky that our last speaker has joined.
I think that's a good idea.
That's a good idea. So we are a bit delayed. I hope you don't mind maybe spending 10 minutes extra, a bit more time here. So, Alvaro.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you.
I can see you've been doing research in transportation systems.
In the past, yes. In the past,
Okay.
I've done quite a lot. Now I'm working with Fujitsu in AI ethics.
Okay. So
some of them apply to transportation, but not necessarily all of it.
Okay, excellent. I think I would like you to because we really are a bit running a bit late, and it's excellent that you're here. And I will just ask you to proceed with your presentation, please.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
So thank you very much for the introduction. Indeed, my name is Álvaro Cabrejas Egea. At the moment, I work as a principal researcher in AI ethics with Fujitsu Research of Europe. I will present you some of the ways in which Fujitsu is leading the way towards delivering trusted AI. So at the moment, the global prevalence of artificial intelligence and its increasingly ubiquitous role in society and business is impacting every aspect of our lives, really. And it's creating an era in which trust is becoming more important than has ever been before. Given the incredible reach and the effect that the AI systems are having on us, on our planet, on our societies, the harmonious application of these technologies cannot really be guaranteed unless the ethical and cultural values are actually embedded in the design of the AI technologies that operate in our societies. This is simply because when AI makes decisions that relate to human rights of dignity, it becomes absolutely crucial to have confidence that these systems can be trusted in terms of being fair, reliable, and explainable. As a recent example known by everyone, AI is being globally used in drug discovery for addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, we're using AI-powered models and tools to forecast and try to combat the outbreak itself. Given the wonders that AI can do, some key questions arise, especially now are starting to reach the wider public, and they include whether we should trust AI. How can we be certain that certain AI tools are aligned with the ethical values of society? And exactly what is required to even ensure that this alignment is happening? So I will now just very quickly introduce a couple of examples in which problems have been caused for lack of consideration of ethics in AI tools. So the first one is facial recognition, which we all know that it's an issue on a global level. There have been a lot of clear issues that have been identified within this technology, mostly stemming from a highly biased performance. And this has included situations in which statistical minorities, such as Black women, obtain really, really bad accuracies and leads to horrible results in application. While this originates from the technical issues in how the models are conceived and then trained, we also see another entire different set of issues that originate from the non-technical side. For example, some of the organizations that are using and deploying this technology are simply not trusted in the public sphere due to the manners in which they have applied and exploited the technology in the past. In another example, a group of scientists has recently trained an AI to provide moral advice in free-form questions. You can just write the prompt, you get a right prompt, and you can write whatever you want. Given that their training set was not properly audited and curated, the resulting advice has replicated a lot of racial biases when giving the advice. This shows once again that our systems are really no better than the weakest ethical link in the production chain, and also illustrates how unintended biases can really get introduced in any unaudited system, as well as, in my honest opinion, why algorithmically solving ethical dilemmas might just not be the best approach. These examples, I think, that show some of the reasons why we need to really make efforts towards facilitating the identification of these problems and to provide and build the right frameworks to address them on a global level. In terms of addressing it from the point of view of Fujitsu, since 2018, we've been a member of AI for People, which is a multi-stakeholder forum in Europe that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with. AI for People published this first white paper called Ethical Framework for a Good AI Society that was considered by the European Commission's guidelines called Towards Trustworthy AI, to which we also made significant contributions. Along the way towards enabling this trusted AI, Fujitsu has formulated the Fujitsu Group AI Commitment and created an advisory external committee on AI ethics. We've also been selected for a deep dive interview with the AI for EU project, followed the recognition by the European Commission AI high-level expert group. Following this line, in the 2020, we were invited for a perspective interview for the United Nations in the AI for Good Global Summit. Going back to the social implementation of an AI that can be trusted, and as I was saying, not only the technical but non-technical aspects should be considered and improved. In terms of the technical, the AI needs to be fair, it needs to be robust, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be explainable, and it needs to be privacy supporting. While these are topics that are currently under active research and development all over the globe, we are right to ask ourselves, is this enough? Since fairness in itself is not a monolithical concept, fairness criteria needs to be different from region to region and between the business domains where they are applied accordingly. Here, we reckon that in order to apply an AI widely to the real world, to have this product be recognized and to be trusted, the non-technical aspects, such as care for society, care for humans, both in the design but also in the societal perception, are at least as important as the technical aspects alone. There are a lot of complex upcoming requirements that it will not be possible to solve them without considering the non-technical and social aspects. Again, going back to cultural differences, diversity, especially the accountability of AI, which is eminently a social phenomenon and not necessarily a technical one, or even the psychological components of human-computer interactions. Establishing new technologies while satisfying these social requirements is what Fujitsu is currently understanding as their human-centric innovation approach. To make sure that these goals can be achieved, including the development of trusted AI services, we're heavily working on regulation, standardization, and certification. From the point of view of regulation, we are participating in several ongoing international consortium-led discussions, including the EU AI Alliance, the G7 Alliance. The European Commission in this front has been leading the discussions on regulation of AI through the AI high-level expert group and the European consultation on AI, which was a first of its kind initiative in Europe to gather the public's opinion and feeling towards AI, and it constituted the basis on which the recent EU AI Act has been developed. For standardization and certification, we continue to contribute to the AI ethical guidelines from various organizations, including, again, the previously mentioned AI for People, the IEEE Ethically Aligned Design, Oceanis Project, ISO, and IC. To make these efforts internally consistent, the company has created its own AI code of conduct, which in 2019, in March, I believe, it crystallized on the form of a Fujitsu Group AI commitment that was a public statement that was publicized internally and externally. The commitment focuses on the steps necessary to create a human-centric AI that can be trusted, while striving for a more sustainable society powered by this AI, while keeping humans on the decision-making seat. This statement came from a combination of our own employees' code of conduct, the Fujitsu way, and some ethical principles coming from AI for People. The commitment evolved, was expanded in 2020, looking at the ways that we can actually make these principles operational and not simply a beautiful statement of purpose. From 2019 also, and for governance, we established the previously mentioned External Advisory Committee on AI Ethics. They provide continuous feedback on the group AI commitment and keep an ongoing and continuous dialogue with the stakeholders to support the safe and secure deployment of AI in society. The committee is attended by the president, and the results are periodically reported to the board. Lastly, and in terms of education, we are launching a series of company-wide e-learning training and education programs. The first one on ethics has completely been finished by all employees in Japan and is in the process of being deployed worldwide. So in terms of collaboration, we're trying to keep close links to both industry and academia to further update and refine these principles, and essentially to create dynamic and virtual ecosystems of the stakeholders, so to make sure that the problems that we're trying to address are real. This is reflected on the several frameworks that we're working on at the moment, and the driving force behind all of them is the aim to make the different components, the different ethical components required for AI accountability into actual operationalizable actions. In doing so, we are engaged in several collaborations to identify future sector requirements and focusing mainly on fairness, explainability, robustness, and the concepts that I mentioned earlier. We are, for example, working on the more technical sides of AI in collaboration with the City University of London and Intesa Sanpaolo Bank for the development of technologies based on social science and trying to work around fairness. In a collaboration that currently is ongoing with the Technical University of Munich, we're aiming to provide a general accountability framework for real-world applications in the field of self-driving vehicles. Here, we're looking at tracking, assessing, and operationalizing the ethical components of accountability, the individual principles that can make a system accountable, such that they can be put in practice in an industrial scale, but at the same time remain open for auditing. We have another of the projects that we have ongoing is a collaboration with the University of Bologna, which aims to provide the exact definitions and requirement lists for trusted AI so that they can be applied again in a sectorial manner, acknowledging that the requirements and specificities regarding the implementation of these concepts will not be the same across different industries. Another of the recent developments that we've been working on is the creation of processes that are fair by design. The idea behind this design philosophy is centered around the consideration of the potential ethical and fairness related issues as early as in the requirement definition phase of a given project. These considerations are then carried over and expanded as the project advances through the phases of data validations and actual development of AI products. With this, what we aim is to ensure the prevention of further ethical issues down the line due to an early constraining of the project to only operate on ethically acceptable avenues. Within the larger boundaries of these principles and from a more social science-based approach, we have been researching into the biases that can be found within the generative art space. Additionally, and focusing a bit more on the quantitative side of assessment and mitigation, we have produced an open source fairness toolkit, Be Fair, that I will introduce properly in the next slide. But further than this, one other paper that has been published recently is the 1-versus-1 intersectional bias mitigation, where we look at how biases can be found even in already mitigated models when the composing protected categories are checked with an intersectional approach. What this means in practice is that when in a model that you have where the bias mitigation procedures have already been applied to a series of protected categories, let's say race and gender, we might still find biases that persist for specific combinations of the joint values of these variables. Regarding the earlier mentioned Be Fair, the project produced a proof of concept dashboard that has included a phase of research and benchmarking for a number of identification and mitigation strategies for bias. Once we have implemented, tested, and validated them, these have been able to be applied to a data set from the financial sector concerning loan grants from the Intesa Sanpaolo Bank, which was our partner in this project. The focus of the project has been on the comparison between the multiple mitigation strategies, aiming to empower the practitioners when evaluating the trade-offs between their own KPIs and the fairness metrics early in the development of any given product. This development, that as I mentioned, is currently available as open source, has been key in the establishment and development of the fair banking framework, for which you can see the first iteration in your screens right now, and also relates to credit lending. The framework focuses on providing a roadmap that can guide the implementation of systems that are fair and ethical, and it uses 5 stages. On the first one, we would look at the regulatory aspects and make sure that we are conforming to them. We would then assess the data sets, identifying the main ethical issues that can come from them. Then you choose, based on the previous 2, your fairness metric, go through bias mitigation, and eventually go through an iterative process of comparison and choice between all the alternatives that have been generated during the process. The work was published in a FILA 2020 paper, And from here, I would like to send an open invitation, as at the moment we're looking for more use cases and ways to improve this approach, aiming to create and validate fairness and trustworthy frameworks. So if you have a data set or a project that you think that you could benefit from this, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Lastly, as I introduced earlier, there has been a lot of effort invested in moving from principle to practices and then turning this into actually usable lists of requirements for the next AI technologies to fulfill. Now it's the moment when we need to keep strengthening our collaborations internationally, such that we can keep moving towards the creation and testing of the new generation of standards, allowing for set operationalization of these requirements at a scale. These are going to be needed for the near future business opportunities that AI is providing. At Fujitsu Research, we aim to keep working to establish several best practice exemplars in building the trusted AI of the future that follow the ethical requirements of, again, fairness, transparency, robustness, explainability, and privacy. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. I think we should just take time for questions, please. So you could also write in the chat and I can unmute you. We are not that many people, so.
It's quite a cozy session.
Okay. Oh, I can see there's one raised hand, but I can only see it in the chat. Who did it come? Who?
It's me, just a short question from my side. So thank you for all for both of the presentations, which was very, very interesting. For me, it would be interesting, since you, Alvaro, you are directly embedded in the economic incentives in the business environment, and since that was part of my presentation, I would be interested if you are somehow, and of course if you can talk about it at all, if you also feel these dilemmas between ethical values, since that's your position, but also some cost pressure situations, some efficiency pressure. So this typical dilemma between ethical values and economic incentives. That would be interesting.
So I imagine that the corporate answer is that we absolutely need to balance these two, and etc., etc., etc. But since you're asking me and not Fujitsu, luckily this is not something that I need to deal with on my day-to-day, me personally. I come from the AI ethics team, and that is our priority. And the KPI optimization goes onto the business lines. However, precisely in one earlier slide in this presentation, I acknowledged implicitly that this trade-off exists, and this trade-off exists in many organizations. And that's why I believe that it's interesting to, first of all, acknowledge the different definitions of fairness that we can find. Because as anyone that has ever used a fairness toolkit is like, yeah, sure, if you implement a fairness mitigation, you might get like a worsening of your accuracy of your classifier or whatever by 1 or 2%, but we're not talking about that. The reality is that there is not one mitigation strategy that actually mitigates all of the different measures of fairness simultaneously. So even at the moment that you decide that you're going to use some fairness mitigation strategy, there you already have your first trade-off. So from my point of view, and I'm really sorry, because in a way I'm just wrapping the whole thing around, turning it around and throwing it back at you. But the trade-off comes in the first moment that we actually decide a certain metric to assess a certain data set. So going down from there, yes, there will always be trade-offs, but then an entirely different question is how will different companies and actors in the commercial side of things, because again, my commercial stunt is very short, I'm coming from academia, but this is a real thing. There will be a series of often antagonistic requirements that while that you can't optimize at the same time. So, but the thing is that also as a society, we are going to a location where trust is important. Like my whole presentation was on that. And there is such a thing as a social capital. So at some point, companies globally are going to have to decide whether to squeeze 1% more efficiency for their KPI, or potentially lose an amount of social credit based on trust that may cost them more than that. Sorry, the answer came a bit ranty and long-winded, but I hope that I contributed to answering your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really happy to hear that one more, of course, at the moment, rather bigger companies have these AI ethics groups, because that's the right step. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing your experiences.
Okay. Any other questions, please?
I think that Susanna wrote on the chat.
Okay, just a second. I'll just see. In my chat, I don't have anything.
That's
Susanna,
okay.
please.
Hi. I have two questions. The one is for Alvaro. Can you please repeat that the invitation that you mentioned with regards to Intesa Sanpaolo? That's my first question. And then my second question is for Jacob. And what I really wanted to understand is, how do you see the symbiotic relationship going forward between man and machine? Yeah, thank you.
So, Alvaro, please. The first question was for you.
Should I get back the slide, or simply? Well, no. The most straightforward answer is that we have in terms of, and I need to make very clear that this is something that this specific project happened before I joined Fujitsu proper, and while I've read the papers and I've read the documentation, I might not be able to provide as much detail depending on what Susanna exactly wants. But the reality is that recently Fujitsu has made open source one toolkit, which was essentially for assessing fairness and credit applications, which at the end of the day, in the most machine learning sense of way, are simply classifiers. You're classifying people and you're saying, do you deserve a loan? Do you not deserve a loan? There were some fairness issues related to this. So some metrics were developed, they were integrated into a dashboard such that practitioners that do not necessarily have the required programming experience to implement these tests themselves can go directly and still exercise these checks. And this led to the creation of the fair banking framework that I published earlier. And simply, this is an iterative process to ensure that the definition of these systems is fair by design, and it's assessed for fairness at all different stages of the definition process. And I guess that the invitation that Susanna is referring to is that at the moment we're open for partners. We have tried and been quite successful with Intesa Sanpaolo, but we have an open call for partners. If anyone has a data set that thinks that could benefit from these kind of approaches, or an interesting project for which fairness could be assessed, we are more than happy to get in touch. I can drop my email in the chat. And Susanna, if it's of interest to you, please reach out. I will leave the floor now for questions.
Thank you. So Jacob, please.
Yes, it's of course an interesting question, and it's difficult to answer. But I think in the very big picture, if we talk about the Anthropocene, maybe the Anthropocene as human beings, as a geological force in our contemporary age, maybe there's also a relation to technology that is important. And of course, we have always been using technology, and we have fundamentally an instrumental relation to the world. We use the robot as an instrument do something. We use technology as something that can help us. And that could, in some sense, be one of our problems. So there's the instrumental relation, there's a fundamental ontology in the sense that will the world be populated by more different species? But on the other hand, what does this mean? That there's this problem that if we let you make anthropological studies of the relation to the machine and the robots, it's not only instrumental. There's also, for example, the example I mentioned, there's also a social relation. And what does this mean for understanding our ethical categories? So this use and development of technology also helps to ask many very fundamental questions about what you could call the ontology of ethics. And the whole question is, as I also, in fact, as we have been talking about ethics at this conference, we have a lot of categories of traditional concept of ethics that we apply, for example, autonomy, trust, transparency, democracy, equality, and so on. But of course, with the emergence of the power of the machines, the question is, are these concepts sufficient, or do we need to develop new concepts for understanding the development of robotics? So that's a question we need to ask, but I think, of course, this discussion has not finished.
Okay, excellent. Susanna, did that answer your question?
Yes, I think it's a very long discussion, which we don't have time for today. Thank you.
I actually do have a last question before we stop, if that's okay. Because I thought that was a very interesting point. And I was wondering, because for me, it's difficult to imagine a robot suffer, for example. So if you say, can a robot suffer? That would be a criteria whether we should treat it ethically or have ethical considerations. That's also a traditional way of looking at it.
But there
but I was thinking that maybe if I am friends with my robot, and even though my robot can't suffer, then I can suffer if somebody's mistreating the robot that I have anthropomorphized.
Yeah, yes. There was we have a discussion within the ethics of animals, which is the relation between humans and animals, and there was the idea from Descartes that the animal was a machine and you could do whatever you were allowed with the animal. Then came the idea the animal could suffer, but then we have the philosopher Kant, who says the way we treat animals actually is an indication of our own dignity. So if we treat the robot in a very bad way, it also shows something about our own humanity. And you can have this in the age of sustainability. There's of course a whole discussion of reuse of robots. When do you throw the robot out, and so on. So, and which in fact illustrates our sense of humanity. And I was also thinking about this concept of the instrumental relation to the machines and the robots. It's very complicated discussion because, as you say, the robot becomes a friend. You have the ideas of a robot in the house that you can have a small conversation with, and so on. So it changes the kind of beings that we have in the world, and it's there, as I mentioned, the actor network theory, where as Latour argues that if we go back in the age, things had an ontological status also as actors, and there we have how we relate to robots create new agents, and robot becomes agents, but not in the same sense as human beings are agents. So it's open for rethinking these categories.
But I still think that's a long way, because I mean, I think it was Bentham said that, can it suffer? If it can suffer, then we should. And he was in favor of animal rights. Now, the Israeli historian Harari recently made a distinction and said, well, we used to have slaves. And he said, well, maybe in 50 years from now, our modern slaves are the animals that are used in production of meat. So they're our slaves. And we're going to think back of the way we are now as being very, very primitive and very brutal, because we don't recognize their humanity. And I still think that is one discussion. But to say that a robot can suffer, for me, that's still it's a long way.
Yes, of course, but you have this problem that if we recognize a certain social existence of the robot, we cannot only see it as an instrument. So that's the challenge. But of course, it's difficult to say it has feelings and emotions and can suffer, so on. Of course, it's impossible.
Okay, well, I mean, we're definitely over time. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for those who stayed. Thank you very much for the presentations.